Hi guys, welcome back. Here we have another video lecture for Macias's Econ class, Chapter 6, Section 1, Part 2. Alright, this is the second part of Section 1, and you will just be using your Chapter 6, Section 1 notes packet to also record these notes here. There should be enough space left over for you to record these notes. Now in part 2 here, we will be looking at ways that government intervenes in the market to really what it does is it disrupts equilibrium. Okay, and the way it does that, these interventions show up as price ceilings and price floors. Now as we're going through these slides, as usual, I will pause briefly at the end so that you can get your notes down, but remember it's a video lecture, so you can pause the video anyway at any time so that you can get down what you need. Alright, so let's move on with price ceilings and price floors. As mentioned before, these are government's interventions in the market that end up disrupting equilibrium in ways that the market never would. Now, a price ceiling is essentially a maximum price that can be legally charged for a good. And government puts these in place when they think that the market sets a price for various essentials, that this higher price puts these essentials out of reach for some customers. And by some customers, usually they mean the poor. Now, probably the most well-known example of a price ceiling is rent control. Rent control is when the government sets a maximum amount that can be charged for rent in an area, usually in various cities, inner cities like parts of Los Angeles, but rent control exists out here in the suburbs as well. Okay, so it's not just the very worst parts of major cities that have rent control. Rent control exists in most cities throughout the nation. Now, why is rent control even there? Why bring it in? All right. Well, some of the pros is that it creates affordable housing markets for renters. So, in other words, it doesn't price housing out of the hands of some consumers. Again, usually poor people. It can also assist the poor by reducing housing costs overall, so that the poor are not having to use all of their or most of their income just on housing. Now, what are some of the downsides? Now, this next part is where, when instructed, you guys need to leave space so that you can provide yourself some responses when we go over this in class. Now, some of the downsides of rent control. It reduces supply. Okay, reduces supply. Why? Okay, so leave a space here, and in class we're going to go over why rent control, aka a price ceiling, reduces supply. And I'll ask you to think from a supplier's perspective. Next, lower quality housing tends to exist when rent controls are put in place. Why? Again, leave space in your notes so that you can provide a response when we go over this in class. Okay, and when we do that, I'll ask you to think from the perspective of incentive. Now, some other downsides of price ceilings, rent control. A scarce supply of apartments, meaning a low supply of apartments, can lead to waiting lists and sometimes even discrimination. So in other words, landlords will kind of play favorites in who gets some of this scarce housing and who gets left out in the cold. Now, ending rent control, in other words, taking away this kind of price ceiling, would allow the apartment market to reach equilibrium. Remember, natural market forces would then take over once price ceilings are removed. And the apartment market would reach equilibrium, and then we would look at fluctuations in excess demand, excess supply, but the same forces, the interactions between buyers and sellers, would allow the apartment market to reach equilibrium. Now the problem with this is that while it would increase supply of apartments, a good thing, a bad thing is that only some people would be able to afford these apartments. So some of the poor, not all, but some of the poor would be priced out of an equilibrium apartment market. If landlords were to raise rent because a new equilibrium would take over, then current residents may be priced out and end up having to leave those apartments. But why would property owners raise rent? Okay, in an equilibrium market, why would property owners raise rent? And this goes, of course, hand in hand with some of the stuff we've been working on involving equilibrium, excess demand, and excess supply. But again, leave yourself a space so that you can answer this in class when we go over it together. And then lastly, we would reach a stable market, okay, an equilibrium, but again, some consumers would be left out. Okay, so there's some pros and cons to price ceilings and government intervention in a market. Now let's take a look at price floors. Price floors are minimum prices set by the government, so in other words, set in law. These are minimum prices that must be paid for a good or a service. Okay, so the price can only go so low for some items when the government steps in. Now, the most well-known example of a price floor is the minimum wage. The minimum wage is a minimum price that an employer can pay for a worker's or a person's labor. Remember, a wage is simply the cost of that person's employer. A wage is simply the cost of a person's labor that the employer has to pay. Okay, I'll say that again. Remember that a wage, in other words, the amount that you get paid per hour, that is the cost that the employer has to pay for your hour of work. That's a wage. Okay, so a minimum wage is the minimum amount that an employer can pay you for your labor. Okay, so essentially you are selling your labor to the employer for a minimum price. So that way you will always get a minimum income, a minimum price for your labor. Now, each state can set its own minimum wage as long as it does not go below the federal minimum wage. Right now, I believe the federal minimum wage is $10, might be a little bit below that, but as long as states do not set their minimum wage below the federal amount, they can set whatever minimum wage they want. Now, the benefit to this, of course, is that hourly workers will never make less than a certain amount. And again, that amount will vary state to state. Okay, so the worker will always get paid at least a certain amount. The negatives is that if the minimum wage exceeds equilibrium price for labor, unemployment occurs. All right, let's explain that. So if the minimum wage exceeds equilibrium price, so in other words, if the minimum wage is more than what employers are willing to pay for labor, they're not going to do any hiring. So think of it from a buyer's perspective. The employer is the buyer. If the minimum wage, in other words, the minimum price for labor, is more than what the employer is willing to pay, they're not going to buy. In other words, demand is going to go down. Okay, so I want you to use, when we go over this again in class, in your own words, you'll explain why when minimum wage exceeds equilibrium, unemployment occurs. Okay, make sure you leave space. All right, so like I told you guys, part 2 of section 1 was going to be pretty short. So This will conclude the Chapter 6, Section 1 lecture. Make sure you have these notes ready for me to check, and don't forget to compose your questions along the left-hand margin, your summaries along the bottom, and have these notes ready to go when we take the final exam, which we are looking at during that first day or two of May. All right, but we'll go over that more in class. All right, guys, have a good night, and we'll see you in class. Take care. Bye.